Hi, everybody. Welcome to the VeriDAO channel. Today we have a great interview with some really brilliant minds, and hopefully Reggie Middleton will be stopping by. We're going to be discussing the effects of the recent SEC versus Ripple case and how that might give us a little more clarity on whether the Veri token is a security or not. So we'll be right back right after this. Give us a like and share the video. We've got some great news that broke, and I think the heavens opened up, and we had my inbox filled up with emails, and everybody was tweeting and sending messages, and it felt like a new Independence Day for crypto. Anyway, when the Judge Torres came with her decision on the SEC versus Ripple case, I understand it is a split decision, and I think that plays even more interesting bits into it. But we have some questions for you guys. I want to introduce everybody first. Thanks for joining us. William is my friend and fellow VeriDAO member and has put a lot of time and research into the facts around the original case that the SEC settled with Reggie on regarding Veritaseum. And we wanted to talk about how that would be affected by this or play into this. So, William, thanks for joining us and joining me on this interview.
Glad to be here.
We also have Nick Morgan from ICANN, Warrior for Truth, and out there battling for the little guy. Nick, how's it going?
Going well, thanks. Thanks for having me, Lisa.
Great. I really appreciate you coming. And my friend, Greg from Rivet. You can find us both on World Blockchain Roundtable every Thursday morning. Greg has sorted past. I'll let you you'll tell the people about that might apply to this conversation.
Somewhere between 2005 and now, I found my way through law school and with the side stop for a punk rock band fronting thing. We don't have to talk about that. It's really not relevant.
That was the sort of part I was talking about.
Yeah, right. To the software as it touches legislative world to today. I've sort of been interwoven throughout this pursuit for more freedom that the whole movement kind of represents, and I've just sort of shifted my focus as to where I've been sort of fighting for this cause. So a thing that I was fighting for before was cool, I guess, but it was a thing that I was also fighting for in the wrong arena until I found myself here. So that's where I am today.
Awesome. And the one and only father of DeFi, Reggie Middleton. Thanks for joining us. I'm glad that you got through that tunnel and were able to join us. So good morning.
Thank you. Good morning. Fair warning. I'm going to Jersey, so there's another tunnel, but because of traffic, if I get there.
Well,
here's a fun trivia fact. Most people in New York don't realize they live on a set of islands. Ask anybody in Brooklyn if they live on Long Island, and they'll tell you no, despite the fact they never had to swim to get to where they're going. Fun fact. Try it out.
Wow.
Quite an infrastructure. Yeah. So Reggie, before we got started, you had an interesting look at the recent case and how it might apply to Veri. I know in some of your settlement, you have to be careful of some of the things you say or what you talk about, but I'd like to start with you and get everybody's view on, what do you think? Opine a little bit about the SEC versus Ripple case and how that might affect Veritaseum.
Okay, so
not Veritaseum, but Veri token.
I'm going to start off with the usual disclaimer. This is not legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't go to law school. This is strictly my layman's non-professional opinion. I have issues with members of the enforcement arm of certain agencies in terms of ethics, etc., and following the law. And so this is far from an unbiased perspective. But as I understand it, hope I gave enough to clear myself of any wrongdoing if I give my opinion. But as I understand it, if you were to set up a peer-to-peer programmatic exchange of the digital assets that are Veri tokens, where those who are purchasing it would not be aware or even have knowledge of whether they are giving that compensation to the Veritaseum entity or any centralized entity. Then I think it might fall under the proximity of this judge's order, and that the Veri token would not be or at least the transaction of the Veri token would not be an investment contract, hence the Veri token wouldn't be a security. Now, that's my layman's perspective, but I've alleged that from the very beginning. And even though I believe she said she didn't comment on secondary market transactions because that question wasn't before the court, she did comment on programmatic exchange, which is secondary market through smart contracts. As a matter of fact, it's also the same through centralized exchanges because those are also programmatic exchanges. It's done through a centralized server using a order book and a bid-ask mechanism. Technically, but what do I know, right?
Well, I think that we'll all lean on your knowledge for some of this. Nick, can you give me your thoughts of the judgment and kind of? I'm sure you had a buzz at your office.
We did, and we still do. So I think I agree with what Reggie just said. I'll throw in my own disclaimer. I am a lawyer, although unlike Greg, I've never been in a punk rock band, so I don't have that going for me. But this isn't legal advice, so nobody should rely on what I'm saying and go take action on it. I'm happy to give legal advice, but probably not in this setting. Anyway, that out of the way. This is a phenomenal ruling, and I would say we can get into the details, but the primary thing that it achieved is that it's going to change the vocabulary from is this token a security to is this transaction a securities offering? Is it an investment contract? And that's the most important, I think, thing that is consistent with the point you were making, Lisa, that the fact that the judge broke this up and decided it differently in different ways is very helpful. So I think we'll get into more detail. I think that's the primary benefit of this ruling is to change the vocabulary around instead of is this thing a security, is this transaction a securities transaction? You got to look at every transaction. You got to look at it at different points in time, and you might get different answers for different transactions and different points in time.
Interesting. I want to get Greg's thoughts on this, but that just leads me into so many more of. We have some great questions for you guys. So, Greg, let me know what your thoughts are on this.
Well, I think they reconciled crypto and securities law with reality by what they did. Like, this is the only way it actually makes any kind of sense. And when you think back on it, it's kind of one of those duh moments where we've all been so close to this that we haven't really been paying attention to the blindingly obvious legal fact that's been staring us in the face, right? If they applied the same rule to the Howey test back when they actually tried that case, it was about fruit orchards, right?
Yeah.
Imagine going to the grocery store and not being sure if you could buy apples, because you're not sure if the grocery store is a licensed dealer or not, because they're not sure if their apples are securities or not. Right? Like, it's a very similar kind of distinction, right? To me, this is just like, hey, sanity's back. It doesn't feel like Clown World as much anymore here.
Right.
I mean, they did leave open, right, the limited ruling, but that's pretty normal for the court to do, and I don't think that they didn't mean to imply that you could extend logic further, because it seemed like a return to logic. Maybe there's sort of an undertone of, yeah, we can't rule on secondary markets, but we kind of just said how you ought to play this out in your head, unless you're Gary Gensler and you're going to try to torture it, right? So,
well, if you're Gary Gensler, you'd send the Girl Scouts a Wells notice for selling apple pies on the corner.
You would.
That's right. Or cookies.
You probably look forward to tons
cookies,
of those cases cropping up everywhere.
Yeah. Well, and that leads me to my next question. So in the Torres decision, did that only apply to Ripple and XRP, or does it apply to other tokens as well? Nick, you want to take the first one?
Yeah. So this is a ruling by a federal district court judge in one case. She happens to sit in a very important venue, the Southern District of New York, where the SEC likes to bring cases. The judges tend to be, as this judge is, tend to be very sophisticated in matters of securities law and other things. But it's one federal court judge whose opinion is not precedent, is not controlling on other judges in her district, in other districts. So it's super important because of where the opinion came out of, but it is not controlling. And I can tell you, having litigated for and against the SEC, they will say that this opinion is limited to this judge, this district, these facts, and they'll take contrary positions on other tokens in other places. So it's super important, very helpful, but it's limited.
Interesting. Greg, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, just to follow on with that, I mean, it's still really great persuasive precedent, because what he's going to set up every time is basically some variation of an ever more clever, do you really want the apples at the grocery store to be securities, Gary? Response, right? Like, it's kind of a losing battle with respect to rhetoric, right? If you want to just look at it from a purely persuasive angle from a general public standpoint, yeah, different judges may come down differently, and different judges may feel very differently about it for reasons nothing to do with this particular aspect of the problem, right? But the neat thing is, right now we have this, and the case is situated in such a way that this narrative has time to take hold. In my opinion, the fact that an interlocutory appeal is going to be like super hard to pull off right now, because it would be, I would imagine, in the best interest of everybody over at Ripple to keep that kind of ground down to a halt if it can. And the case actually has to proceed to its conclusion, right? We can keep this story sort of just floating. This precedent sits here until they get another one that's contra to it. And the longer we talk about it and the longer we reinforce the things that it says, the more common knowledge it feels like this is supposed to be the way things are. We can sort of turn around the idea that like actually somehow magically apples are securities now, because we've got something that says they aren't. And there's somebody that people don't have to obey, but they probably should listen to.
Interesting. That leads me to my next question. And Greg, you've already answered. That's great. But I was wondering, do you see the SEC appealing this, or is that a risk for them to have the first part of their decision that they won on, I guess, overturned? Nick, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, Greg used the right phrase, interlocutory appeal. So that means appealing something while the case is going on, before the case is done. So normally you only can take an appeal once you have a final order in the case that resolves everything. The judge's order did not do that. There are lots of unresolved issues. There's part of this that she's saying has to go to trial. So I expect the parties will get together, the defendants and the SEC will get together and decide whether or not to take this up on an appeal before the case is over. Given the importance of the issues that were decided, I suspect they probably will take an interlocutory appeal, and both sides will want the part that they won preserved and the part that they lost overturned. So you're going to have, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals probably deciding an interlocutory appeal before the case is over, which means, we'll get an answer earlier than we otherwise would. An answer, from a higher court, which would have controlling precedent on any federal court within the Second Circuit.
Curious what makes you think that's going to be the strategy that they'll both choose?
Sorry, say that again, Greg?
What makes you think that's going to be the strategy that they're both going to align with?
You mean in terms of taking an interlocutory appeal?
Yeah. Why would for example, Ripple not take an adversarial approach to the effort?
Well, I think that the part that still has to be tried, which is the there were three buckets. There were the institutional sales, the programmatic sales, and then the executive and consultant transactions. And that's that third bucket that still needs to be tried.
Right. Yeah. The institutional stuff.
Yeah. So I think that the answer that the judge gave for the first two buckets weighs heavily on how that third bucket comes out. And so I think it's in the interest of all the parties to get the Second Circuit's view. And if you're Ripple, do you really want to go all the way through a trial on the third bucket? and then appeal. So, reasonable minds could differ on the strategy, whether to appeal now or not. I just think that both sides probably have an interest in getting.
For sure. And for what it's worth, that little wing it version of it that I gave right before you talked about it was sort of a version where, I was driving their legal strategy and we were going to play for narrative, right? Like, I don't know if they're going to do that. So, for what it's worth, that was sort of our divergence there. But I think you're right. That's interesting. Cool. Thanks for indulging.
I have a question I want to ask the legal eagles. So, if the SEC of course has motivation to go for interlocutory appeal, but the judge, they stick to the facts in terms of the programmatic sales, and so they're going to appeal on her interpretation of law, which seems to be pretty tightly entwined with the stipulated facts. Do you see the SEC having a reasonable opportunity of succeeding on appeal for the programmatic sales? Because the way the judge worded it, it looks like a slippery slope for them. Or am I just looking at it as too much of a layperson?
No, that's a great question. So in my view, the SEC sort of got what it wanted in one sense. In other words, there were a lot of us, and my group, ICANN, was among the people urging the court to go much further than it did, and to recognize that Howey, a test created in a case in 1946, really is an outdated tool, and the SEC really should go get more statutory authority from Congress before it tries to regulate an entirely new industry. So that was the position we took. The judge didn't pick up on that at all. The judge seemed to conclude implicitly that Howey is a usable tool here. We can use Howey to apply to the digital asset space. So in that sense, the SEC won that issue, but then it lost on the application of that test to the programmatic sales. So I just lost the train of Reggie's question. The odds of success on that argument. So one risk for the SEC is that the Second Circuit says, gee, maybe Howey's not the right tool. I don't think there's a great risk there of loss for the SEC on that. I don't know. It's hard to predict. I think that the judge's Howey analysis is correct in the sense that you have to apply Howey to transactions, not to things. So will the Second Circuit analyze the programmatic sales differently? I'm a biased observer. I think her analysis is pretty good. It seems to tie in pretty tightly, but hard to say.
Well, the interesting thing to me is you'd have to be arguing that somehow, like if you wanted to make that claim, you'd have to be arguing that somehow intrinsically in the nature of the programming, you're creating some kind of contract, right? Like it has to be a promise transmissible via blockchain, right? That's taking the metaphor of smart contract far too literally. Like it's an easy mistake to make, but when you look really close, like there are some things about smart contracts that make them look a lot more like smart regulators than smart contracts, right? Like they're not actually refereeing anything in advance so much as they are coordinating activity that's happening in an instance. You don't really get to say like, we had a contract between myself and this other person on this bid-ask exchange, right? That existed for a split second and therefore it was a security. Right, because there was a promise there for one moment that was completely resolved or made and resolved by software. Right, like, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you look at the details of how it plays out over time. So I think they're going to have a hard time with that, and I also think that they have a hidden landmine that there's going to be a lot of pressure from other agencies for them to not trip over, because we've already got a court that if they're going to go up on appeal and they're going to win, they're going to have to probably lean heavily on Chevron and say the lower court abused its discretion when it overrode our interpretation of what the securities laws meant. And right now they're facing an unfriendly system to that because the winds are starting to change on Chevron. And if they risk that and they lose, they're going to be the least popular people in DC.
So probably helps to, I think you've got a great point there, Greg, to unpack your Chevron comment. So Chevron, of course, is a case involving the EPA from decades ago in which the Supreme Court said that courts should defer to agencies like the SEC or the EPA in their interpretation of the laws that they're applying. And so obviously that Chevron case itself had nothing to do with the SEC, but the concept, you're right, is very much applicable to SEC interpretation. So here we've got an interpretation of the definition of security. And so the SEC is saying, and always says to courts, hey, we're the experts on securities law, not you, judge. You should defer to us in our interpretation. And
and really de novo converts to do deference to this regulatory body, right? That has has a vested interest in the outcome,
right?
And it's not just a vested interest in their mission; it's a vested interest in how they get paid and how their friends get paid and how they continue to grow and influence, right? There's a very political element to regulatory law embedded in the concept that I think we would be unable to process how this is going to play out without taking into account at least a little bit.
Okay, I clicked the wrong button, and I guess I missed everything that related to an answer to my question.
I've got it recorded for you, Reggie.
Okay, so
I've got it recorded for you.
So I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I'm gonna assume that somebody agreed with a portion of what I said, that because the appellate court would be reticent to argue with stipulated fact, or facts that were stipulated to. But let's just assume that this ruling empowers entities such as VeriDAO or, the library people or everybody, right, who was affected. And then they decide to bring suit against the SEC for whatever reason. The SEC has limited resources because the SEC is now starting to ramp up against entities who are able to defend themselves. Coinbase has a lot of issues, and I'm not going to get into that here, but they have a lot more issues than I think the layperson understands. But they're still a public company with at least $800 million in cash on a balance sheet, a minimum. And then there's Ripple, and then there's several other entities, Gemini, et cetera, et cetera. These entities are very, very different from the startup ICO companies that may have a few $1 million to spend, but can drop $200 million at the same time that they can't produce revenue. So, 4 or 5 dozen cases like this, and it drops the SEC immediately. Even if the SEC just moved to file motions to dismiss, that could overpower them. Do you see that as a possibility?
No. They have plenty of resources. And if they don't have enough, they can use that to go to Congress and get more. A battle of attrition against the SEC is a tough one to win. They have lots of resources. So.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought as well until I got an inside look at it, and it is possible to overpower them. Especially over the short term. They can't go to Congress and get new resources in time to do multiple civil suits immediately. I noticed now, and it's dangerous for me to say this, but I do think it's factual, so I'm going to go out on a limb. The SEC's power is that they drain most entities in the administrative realm.
Mm-hmm.
They contact you, they ask for information voluntarily, and depending on what their agenda is, they then send you actual subpoenas, administrative subpoenas. They may even bring you to an administrative trial, etc. But this is in the administrative realm where they have basically all the power. And it's not civil, where you can actually subpoena them and, demand depositions, etc. If they go against multiple entities with resources, they can't just go to Congress and say, listen, we need our budget up, next week because we have, 600 extra depositions. That's not the way it works in reality, at least from my little glimpse of the inside.
Right. That's exactly right. Yep.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. And then I think another thing to point out there too is like the one 800-pound gorilla in the room here is Coinbase, and I don't know if you guys know Brian Armstrong very well, but that guy's a zealot. He's not going to back down. Like they're up against now a loss on a group of people who persevered, and they thought Coinbase was going to be the first through the door that fought them to the end. Like that was the strategy was to push this and push this and push this and drain the Ripple guys, and they just stuck with it, man, right to the end, and then they won. Because they remembered the one thing that everybody seemed to forget. The law seems to be on our side here. Like I think that's the key thing to remember is like, regardless of the strengths or weaknesses of a strategy or a procedural maneuver or a set of adversaries, law is kind of written to not do what the SEC wants it to do. And I think that that's going to come out more and more as courts rule on more and more cases.
Yeah, see, the danger with that is that, you can be right all you want, but you still have to pay for it.
Yeah, well, it's true. I think it's really more of a war of attrition against Gensler. Like as soon as he's gone, a new leadership can come in, right? I think that's the ultimate long war win, right? Is somebody who comes in who's not trying to scorch the earth.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to defend Gensler. No, I'm not. That's not true. But I'm going to be a bit more realistic. Gensler's behavior is no different than Clayton's. Remember who sued? Gensler didn't sue Ripple. Clayton did, and he sued at midnight of the day he was to retire. Gensler didn't sue Veritaseum. Clayton did. Gensler didn't sue Telegram. Clayton did. Gensler didn't sue Library. Or didn't go after Library, etc. So, a lot of people are confusing partisan politics or the bureaucrat who happens to have been appointed at a given point in time with the mission of the SEC. And the mission of the SEC, from my layman's perspective, and also someone who's a participant in this industry, is to basically raise the entrepreneurial participants out to make room for somebody who's not entrepreneurial.
Yeah,
not part
totally.
of the club. So yeah, Clayton is. I'm not feeling Gensler, but he's doing exactly what his predecessor did.
Right.
If you think of the guy before Clayton, no issues at all. Right?
Yeah, I just think that all those
guys
this started
with
the same power structure, right? Like, there's not really that big of a difference between who Biden appointed because somebody else is puppeteering him behind the scenes, and who Trump appointed because he was really weak to flattery and would be keen to appoint even Michael Bolton or what was it, Bullard? The hell's his name? I call him Michael Bolton. It's not Michael Bolton, is it? John Bolton.
Bullard.
Just because he's really good at giving compliments, right? Like all of these people are sort of the same constant revolving door of power class folks who come into DC with a mission to accumulate power. It's not a different guy. It's not really a different agenda. It might have a partisan trapping, but whoever's putting forth their administrative appointee horse isn't necessarily picking somebody who's new or has any attachment to them whatsoever. It's more a horse trade between one kind of power and another, I think.
I don't even think it has a partisan trapping. They're doing what they have it said to do.
Nope, we lost Reggie.
Uh-oh.
Oh.
I'm sorry. I was making a phone call at the same time.
Multitasking. I agree that it doesn't matter who's at the head of the SEC, and I would sort of broaden it even further that it's not even so much personality driven. The institution is set up in a way that it has all gas pedal and no brake pedal. It is designed as a law enforcement agency that seeks to enlarge its jurisdiction, and this subject matter is a great example of that. There has been, since at least 2017 in the DAO report, constant refrain from the industry. Please, SEC, just identify the end of your jurisdiction. Where does use the Howey test, whatever you want. Just tell us how we can arrange a transaction that's not a securities offering that falls outside your jurisdiction. And the SEC's never done that. I don't think through any evil intent by anyone there.
No, it's structure.
The institution is not set up to put on the brake pedal and say,
well, what about the Prometheum that had the sweetheart deal and fell right in the lap, and nobody's ever heard of them.
Oh my God!
And all of
That
a
is such a
sudden
plan.
they're fully licensed, and they have all
They're
the
being
answers.
challenged. They're being challenged as well.
And they've got a fully working product that supports 0 tokens right now.
Exactly.
If they have 0 tokens, I guess they haven't violated the law yet.
Yeah,
So,
it's kind of like it's kind of like mentioning the Veri token in their complaint over 150 times, and then in the summary judgment they don't mention it once. It's like,
Yep.
that's deliberate. You can't make that mistake. I don't know.
But if that is deliberate, then does that give clarity that they had every opportunity to mention the token and that they didn't mention the token? As well as then we carry that on to, then the Very Fair Fund is set up, and they finally started paying that out, but they don't ask for the tokens back. So are they complicit in allowing an unregistered security to continue out there? Or have they made it very clear that it's not a registered security by both of those actions?
I think the problem is, like, how do you explain it? How is this token suddenly an investment contract if there's no other contracty flavored things? How does it form a contract? Please point to me where the signature lines are, even if they're digital. Like, I want you to explain to me why this deal is uniquely structured this way, why it's not just a general contract, if it in fact is a contract for investment. Like, what the hell's going on here, guys? And they won't give that kind of detail, I think, because they don't want to signal too much, because they don't really want to get out of the mode we're in.
Well,
like the mode we're in is kind of where they want to live at the moment.
Yeah, that leads to who should be, who legally does make laws. It's not supposed to be the SEC. They're supposed to do the regulation or whatever. William, you want to ask the next question?
Oh, yes. There's a question Trey, one of the other members, had submitted regarding the Taurus decision. Can the Taurus decision work as a standard for Congress to make a framework for DeFi, TradeFi, CeFi to implement in the near term so crypto can innovate? In other words, could they go and take that?
Yeah.
Greg,
you want to take the first shot on that?
Yeah, sure. I could take a crack. I've been thinking about this a lot because they did kind of make a highlight of something that I think is kind of a weird wrinkle in it that I think needs to get ironed out one way or the other. And that's the sort of institutional sales were conflated with the way that they ran all of the ICOs, right? So if you're going to do an initial offering, which you have to do in order to get a decentralized network started, and if you want to sell it and you actually want to use some of those funds to make a little bit of startup capital, which, though not the purpose, it's useful to companies when they're just trying to launch an idea. You kind of run into this catch-22, right? Where for a second it may be something that resembles an investment contract, and then after that it becomes a lot harder to call that, right? Once the secondary sales start to happen on blind bid ask, you run into this problem where, like, how do I start this chicken? Because I can't make a legal egg without damning the whole thing to the SEC forever, right? Like,
now,
I think Hester Peirce's opinion on this one was pretty interesting. The safe harbor idea that she had probably needs to be a part of the picture there, because there may be still some utility for tokens as securities in the long haul, and something that says you've got like 3 years and here's some basic rules you have to follow, but we're not going to monitor it too closely. And when you get here, if you're still doing it, then then we'll look closely at whether or not you need to bow out. I think that sort of thing might be useful, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah. So what this judgment does, though, in one sense, it indicates that if you have an ICO, that is, as long as the funds aren't used to invest in the company to build out the project, let's say everything's already been done, the company went and got private investors that has nothing to do with that. It's totally aside from that, and other issues that have been monies that have been brought in. They can still do an ICO initially, and yet be beyond the reach of the SEC because they didn't use those funds to build out company. Is that correct?
It's hard to say. That's kind of the one gray area of the whole thing, and
there's a lot of gray areas.
This is the biggest one to me, and I think that the funniest part about the consequence of that is like, so if somebody was just to do like a completely completely improper ICO, like the original earliest ones, where they're like, come to this web store and buy this thing.
Right.
It does this. It'll do this someday. It's a software product. Neat, right? Like,
right.
That's how people started selling it. Software product. If we went back to that model and we just kind of ignored all of the SEC stuff, nobody did any KYC. They didn't try to sell it as a gaining in value. They tried to sell like what the product was going to be capable of on the product roadmap. Eventually, the more you break their mode of convention, the less it looks like a security. It seems like the judge says that's controlling in this case, which I think is kind of interesting.
I agree. I also think it's a gray area. If the money is going back to the company, you're in a danger zone, as opposed to if the money from a sale is going from one owner of a digital token to a different.
Okay, sure.
Yeah,
It's a lot less risky.
So that's the criteria then.
Yeah. William, on your question about the legislative front, I don't follow legislation, but I am skeptical that Congress can actually pass any law on any subject, including this subject. So I would put this at low odds. But I do think this ruling, to the extent it's useful, might be useful in other words, useful in getting legislation passed, might be useful in a harmful way. The SEC has taken the position, as it must, that it has all the statutory tools that it needs to regulate the digital asset space. Because if they conceded that they didn't have that authority, they'd have real problems. So here, this may cause the SEC to recognize, oh, wait a minute, there is a gap here. We need to regulate this area where the judge has ruled against us, and may find sympathetic members of Congress to pass legislation that we would not like, filling that regulatory gap and taking away the one win that we have from Judge Torres's ruling. So,
yeah,
careful what you wish for, I guess.
Very interesting. Yeah. That made me think of the REINS Act that they were trying to get pushed through. I don't know that it actually confirmed, but it was to bring Congress to task, especially when it was over dealing with a certain dollar amount, because they saw this trend where Congress was neglecting their duties of serving we the people by creating laws and the structure, and they were passing that duty on to these three-letter agencies, who then, as you said, Nick, were all pedal and no brake, or all gas and no brake, whatever you said. It was so great. So if the REINS Act engages in this, I mean, it's such a big part of the markets. Surely it'll reach the dollar amount to hold Congress to task. The detriment side of it is really interesting, where you were explaining that. But couldn't it also be a framework where they could see, like, okay, well, we maybe needed a different three-letter entity that only does digital assets, or just separate the part of digital assets completely?
Yeah, could be.
Well, my hope is we don't end up fighting a Pyrrhic victory in order to achieve martyrdom, because I think it's what it would take in order to like get Congress to do something meaningfully in the direction we want it to go. Or like Coinbase would have to get shuttered or something ridiculous like that, where like it becomes obvious that the SEC first approved this company and then flushed it down the toilet. Because they can't have that's the weirdest thing to me is they can't have an outcome where Coinbase goes away. They have to have a contrite, repentant Coinbase proceed in its public market role, probably under new leadership, if they really, really want to have an SEC win there, because otherwise it looks bad for them if they win, you know? So I feel like there's the REINS Act is a little bit more on the like probably wish listy side, especially for the current political composition of the government. But something like it could be crafted as a compromise, I guess. I don't know. It's tough to say. I'm kind of like Nick. I don't have much faith in Congress to do anything of value on this issue anytime soon.
Okay,
William, yeah, you have a
Yeah,
question.
a question there. Let's see. Is there any basis in law by which the Torres decision can retroactively give prior SEC defendants recourse to relitigate their cases?
No, I mean, if there was something that recently happened, someone could go and ask their judge to reconsider in light of this opinion. But because, going back to what we talked about earlier, one district court judge's opinion is not controlling over other judges. So you could point it out.
Well, But one of the questions that arises and keeps coming up from some of the other token holders is within the VeriDAO itself is the issue of us having to go for some kind of a declarative judgment or do another no action letter. The no action letter seems to be something that, even though this decision did come down by Taurus, the very token holders are still reluctant and would like that total clarity. And we feel that because of a no action letter, because of Taurus' decision, and because of the fact that, and we haven't talked in great detail, they never mentioned the very token in the final judgment. In fact, it looked like to me they went out of their way not to put it in there.
Yeah,
because
I think you're onto something there. I feel like they're going to ultimately see some de-icing of that kind of behavior. Like people are going to start to feel more comfortable moving their tokens around just because of the next logical step one takes from where this ruling went. But it needs to be precedent before anybody can really act on it. And as far as recourse goes, like retroactive looking back recourse, that's really hard to do because settlements have public policy interest in finality that the courts are sort of loath to overturn. Now, one thing that I've not seen anybody do yet that I think may be a valuable avenue to pursue would be because everybody watched the whole Twitter files saga and saw all of these 3-letter agencies and whatnot have all these weird communications with social media companies and all this other stuff going on in the background that suppress the First Amendment rights of a lot of people during the time period we're talking about here, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you went back and looked for evidence that the SEC was involved in that, particularly with the goal of suppressing this, then you might be able to find something. And it feels to me like there was something there. It felt to me at the time like there was something there, and they still haven't talked about the crypto Twitter files, mostly because I think people who like the Twitter files don't like crypto. In the most way, except that the journalists doing it aren't big fans of crypto. So I don't think they see the urgency or the need to look into that part of the Twitter files, but I suspect it's there. Somebody should chase that down that actually has access to those people that can make them respond to emails because they don't respond to mine.
That would be an interesting thought.
So
Nick, what are your? Go ahead. I'm sorry. No.
I was just going to ask: is that related to the dirty hands doctrine?
Oh.
It would just be like there could be evidence in there that they suppressed certain worldviews, shut up certain people, framed certain narratives, made things look a certain way, that there was coordinated action that made due process not possible. The key is due process. And if it looks like they violated due process through the machinations that they were engaging in with like the GEC and all those speech suppressing agencies, then you could make a fair claim that this was enough to maybe open up the case again and relitigate the settlement. But again, it's still gonna be a long shot. It's just like a strategy that one might pursue if you wanted to throw a Hail Mary.
So the issue of a declarative judgment, that would only be applicable to someone like Reggie and his company Veritaseum in order to do the recourse.
And keep in mind, this is where this is not legal advice stuff matters. This is probably a mole that I wouldn't run down unless I was really certain I could get some results or I got some really good information that, like, for sure this is there. We can go get it. I would be very, very cautious about putting too much stock in this hypothesis before I had some direct information.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
So Nick, what are your thoughts on the kind of the retroactive? I'm thinking about, I know, or it's my understanding, and I could be totally wrong, that token holders of Veri wouldn't be able to receive any kind of declarative judgment because they weren't the named party in the case, but we were the harmed or the injured party.
Right.
Do we have any standing to be able to go back
One
to
of
the
them.
court? One of them, yes. And one of many. Would we be able to go back to the court as an injured party and ask to apply this this precedent that's being set by Judge Torres?
Unlikely you'd get traction with that. Never say never. I'm always in favor of taking a swing at something, but I think that would be a tough ask. It's a little bit like, you may recall in the library case, the judge, there were lots of people, I think you included, and ICANN included, asked the judge to clarify that the injunction against the defendants in that case did not apply to secondary transactions. And the judge was sympathetic, but declined to do that and said basically, hey, look, this case is about SEC versus defendant. It's not that the SEC has not asked us to enter an order that affects secondary trading. So I think that's probably, I haven't examined the Veri case in detail, but that's probably the kind of reaction you'd get from the SEC and the judge is, this case was between us and the defendant or defendants, and you secondary market participants, you're not part of this, even if you were harmed. So,
Yep.
So here's a question, purely hypothetical. I'm not saying the SEC did this, okay, or did not do it. Either confirm or deny, right? But purely hypothetical. Let's assume that the SEC made a statement in public and in their initial complaint that was false, and they did it knowingly, knowing it was false, damaged the price of the underlying of the asset in question, as well as the defendant. Okay, defendant was forced to settle, and then a declarative action was brought showing that the SEC knowingly made a false statement to achieve its means. Would that be something more likely for a judge to rule on in terms of a declarative action?
Yeah, that improves your argument for sure.
Oh, sure.
I hate to do this, guys, but I have to jump on another call. So
Cool, Nick. Well, thanks for
we
appreciate it,
I
Nick.
really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, and
pleasure.
Thank
keep
you for your
fighting the
input.
good
Appreciate
fight.
it.
great to see you all. We'll hopefully talk again soon.
Take care.
Thanks
Yeah,
for having me on.
absolutely.
All right.
All right.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Guy's sharp as a tack. I like talking to him.
Oh, he's great. We've met so many amazing people that are just fighting for the truth, and there's you can see their heart in it as well as everyone on here.
Yeah.
Let's see, William. Let's see. Should we jump down to? Says I had some questions for Nick, but he's gone now. So we'll stick with. We've got a couple more questions. We'd love to have your feedback on. Considering that
Wanted to respond
VeriDAO,
real quickly to what,
go ahead.
Reggie was saying before. If you wanted to collaterally attack the settlement, I think your best bet would be to look for them suppressing general speech about crypto that might have hindered your legal defense. That's probably what I would do if I had a hypothetical case that I wanted to unwind and I knew for a fact that there was proven censorship out there. You might just be able to get somebody to let you go on a little bit of a fishing expedition at Global Engagement Center and see if the SEC was ever over there.
Well, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole.
I wouldn't either, but it's what you could do if you were crazy.
Yeah, I have very specific ideas, but it is not, it's not a safe pool for me to swim in. So
Fair
I'll stay
enough, man.
on land. Okay.
It's usually best to leave those things sealed unless you're really, really sure that when you open it up, you can win the fight.
Yeah. Well, like I said, it's not about right or wrong. It's about your ability to engage in a battle. So
Perseverance, right?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I think we're all engaged in the battle. Well, I think that wraps it up for our questions. I really appreciate you. Do you have any, Greg, do you want to leave us with any parting words or thoughts about this whole situation and what token holders in the secondary market really where they stand now and where they can go forward?
I would say this is really positive for builders, and that's the key. It's if you want to actually one thing that I took away from William from your documents was the sort of pause in provision of value necessary to preserve life and limb that the powers that be instigated by targeting you guys, right? Like they took the DAO and they gutted its purpose and then claimed it was just a pure speculative thing when the functionality you were trying to add to it was a thing you didn't have the energy or time to keep doing. And you weren't sure if continuing to poke the bear was going to continue to poke their ire, right? Like Library built this thing that was a censorship resistant YouTube. Wonder if that had anything to do with the fact that people in power didn't like it. You know, what you guys were building was going to be similarly transgressive on some very, very old, very, very crocodile-y, very, very reptilian power centers, right? Like they were going to have to start doing things a new way if your product went wide. And ultimately, the weapon that they chose was a angry little bald-headed man who doesn't care if he contradicts himself in public, right? Like they sent Gensler after everyone.
I didn't say that.
I know I did.
So that wasn't me. Just so when you're
they're gonna hate my guts.
I didn't say that. Okay.
They're gonna hate even more that Rivet doesn't have a token. So we're just a regular old startup. But
here's a point before I go. The DAO paper came up. They said that the DAO essentially was a security. Oversimplifying. Am I correct?
They said that the governance token was not of any utility.
Right.
Or
but it was said
sufficient utility to override its purpose as a speculative investment.
Okay, so now, and the governance token. Okay, the governance token was not fit into the DAO, but other assets were fit into the DAO. And the governance token could have been fit into the DAO. That's how it works with the more sophisticated DAOs later on, Uniswap DAO, etc. Because the DAO itself is a programmatic exchange of assets.
Right.
And this judge has just made it very clear that the programmatic sale of assets means that they're not security, primarily because the investment into a common enterprise prong hasn't been satisfied.
Well, if you want to know
think if you take a step back and look at it, she has just knocked down the SEC's logic in the DAO paper.
Yeah. Well, if you guys had fought all the way to the end, I probably would have argued that there's no way to create a security in an interest primarily driven by the value of rents.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for another
Reggie.
episode on the VeriDAO channel. Greg, I really appreciate your time. And Reggie, you are a gift to all of us. Thank you so much for joining us and for creating DeFi. So see you guys next time on the VeriDAO.
Okay. Thank you.